Welcome. Glad you could make it. And we'll start off, of course, with our bracha.
Hi, Judith. Judith
Hi.
is here.
Yes, that's great to see you, Judith. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
So I'm going to go ahead with screen share. And so we were finishing up the specific mitzvot regarding the Kohen Gadol. And so I just want to continue here. So we were saying that if in fact a close relative of his were to pass away, he was not to go out of the mikdash, right? And lo yetze, he shall not go out. I was reading some Torah T'mimah on this, and so I'm thinking as we're doing this, I can go back and look at that particular issue. So let's take a look back here. Umin hamikdash lo yetze. This is the Torah T'mimah here. Mate lo mate. If someone passes away, a close relative of his passes away, and no yotze achar hamita, he does not follow the buyer. Shnei Emor, because it says umin hamikdash lo yetze, because it says from the sanctuary he should not go out. And this, as you can see, is from the Talmud in Sanhedrin, page 18a. And there's a lengthy Torah T'mimah on this. So this is ayin, and here's ayin right here. And you may recollect yesterday that I had said that we don't necessarily take that literally. And what's really nice is this Torah T'mimah goes into that particular issue. He says, Ze zo da'at Rabbi Yehuda. He says, this is the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda. Before I go on at all, I would appreciate it if you find that this is getting way too technical. Let me know. I've been sticking to Rashi for the most part, but on the other hand, I think it's sometimes interesting to delve deeper into these things, at least to even give you a sense of to what extent this can start going as we go deeper and deeper into these subjects. That Rashi just gives us a wonderful introduction into the whole idea of parshanut and explaining the Torah and stuff like that. But I'm hoping, of course, that we should all live so long and be well that perhaps we can get through the Rashi on the Torah and start delving into this. And there's no end to it. It's a lifetime. There's no question that there's a lifetime or maybe several lifetimes of study that are involved in this. So this is Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. He should not leave the sanctuary to follow the buyer as it goes to the cemetery. The Rabbi Meir Sfarale, but now we have this machloket, this dispute between Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. Sfarale, he's of the opinion, she'im oseh heker beyitziato, that if he makes some kind of recognition, some kind of marking when he goes out, in other words, he does something. I had suggested yesterday that when they turn into one alley, he stays around the corner. So that would be what we're talking about here. Shelo yavo lidei nigiat tuma, so that he doesn't possibly come to touch become defiled through contact of some kind. And, in other words, it even has to do with, a canopy, being under the same canopy. Right. So he says, Kagon, for example, im holech merichuk or merachok, if he follows from a distance, if he follows the procession, ukodome hekerim, and similar kinds of distinctions, mutar lo latzeit. It is permitted for him to go out of the sanctuary. The Rabbi Yehuda Sfirale, and Rabbi Yehuda, the first opinion we had, holds the afal pi she'oseh heker, that even though, despite the fact that he may make this kind of marking, this kind of distinction, asur lo latzeit, it's still forbidden to him to go out, mishum, on account, the dilma, perhaps, agav merirute, on account of the bitterness he feels, his grief, in other words, mikre v'naga. It could happen that he would come in contact because he is so overwhelmed by his grief. So Rabbi Yehuda feels that's not going to be helpful. The tam plug tatam, and the rationale for their argument, their disagreement, mevu'ar b'gemara, it's explained in the Gemara, in the Talmud, the Rabbi Meir lo sfira le ke Rabbi Yehuda, that Rabbi Meir does not argue, he does not hold like Rabbi Yehuda, the Eino Yotze Miklal, that he doesn't go out. He just disagrees with Rabbi Yehuda that the high priest doesn't in fact go out at all from the entrance of the Beit HaMikdash, of the temple. Mishum, because if this was the case, if this were the case, afilu leveito nami lo yetze, that he wouldn't be able to go back home. He'd have to be in the Beit HaMikdash. In other words, if we were to take this verse literally, then how does he ever get home to be with his family? Because people didn't live in the Beit HaMikdash. He had his home outside the Beit HaMikdash, and he'd go home when he wasn't working as a high priest. Elahachi kamar, but this is what it means, umin hamikdash lo yetze, when it says he should not go out from the sanctuary. By those words, it means lo yetze mikdushato le yetze. In other words, he shouldn't lessen his holiness, his sanctity. That when it says min hamikdash, it means he shouldn't do anything to reduce his holiness, his sanctity. V'hainu, and what this means, sheyizaher shelo yitama, he should be very careful, very mindful that he should not become defiled. V'kevan sheyesh lo heker, and going on with Rabbi Meir's argument, and since he's made some kind of distinction, to remind him, keep him about this, lo ata leminga, he's not going to wind up coming in contact with the deceased. For Rabbi Yehuda Sfirale, but on the other hand, Rabbi Yehuda holds the afal pi she'oseh heker, that despite the fact that he's made some kind of marking, some kind of distinction, b'chol zmut, nevertheless, chayshinan, we are concerned, dilma agav merirute naga, that the his being overwhelmed by grief, the deep grief that he feels, he is just going to not pay sufficient attention, and he's going to wind up coming in contact. And for this reason, he should not leave the sanctuary at all. Upashut the halacha ke Rabbi Yehuda. And it's interesting that, in fact, the Torah T'mimah holds that the halacha actually is understood to follow Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. And he goes on to say, Ve'eino mevu'ar ma kasha le'le Rabbi Meir. And it's not so clear as to why Rabbi Meir has a problem with just taking this literally. Why does he feel he has to go into an explanation as to, to give this sort of not literal interpretation of the verse? Why doesn't he just take it the way Rabbi Yehuda takes? So his objection was that if it means exactly what it says, it means he can't even go to his home. He can't ever go home. Umay kusha, what's the difficulty here? Why wouldn't he be allowed to go back home? kevan de'achar hamet heveh hatam, because it's only regarding the following of the body, right? Where only the context of this prohibition is simply following the procession, the funeral procession. It doesn't have to do with going home or leaving the mikdash. It's saying if it's a matter of following the funeral procession, he shouldn't go. He shouldn't leave the Beit HaMikdash. But it doesn't deal with a situation of he can't even go home, shelo yitma, because we're worried that he's going to become defiled. So what's the problem if he goes back home? So what reason would there be to prohibit going out of the mikdash to go home? V'hinei, and this is just really some amazing scholarship that is going on now. V'hinei habach, Bach stands for Bayit Chadash, and it's commentary in the Gemara here, and he says here the Bach Bahagaot HaGemara in his notes on the Gemara. So on a Gemara page, you have these little, they're tiny little notes basically on the text of the Gemara that were from the Bayit Chadash. I'm just not recollecting this very moment who the actual the name of the author of it, but it's called Hagahot Habach. So in the Gemara, Higia, he makes a note, de makom levetor, that in fact, instead of writing levetor to his house, tzarich lomar mi beitor, that there's actually, he's suggesting that the text of the Gemara needs to be amended to read, instead of to his house, from his house. That's what it should write. That's what it should read. Ustam kavanato, and he didn't explain very much why he says this. Why does he feel there's a need to change the text of the Gemara? The katav rak, that the only thing he said is rak shekein nireh lo lahagia. He says, that's what I think. That's all he said. He doesn't explain his rationale. He just says, I think this is the way we should read this statement as mi beito. V'yesh lomar shekashe lo kama sheher arnu. And it's one could argue, one could say that the reason why the Bach is doing this is that he has the same difficulty that we just explained. In other words, what's the problem that Rabbi Meir has with Rabbi Yehuda's interpretation? Demai kushya leila Rabbi Meir. What's Rabbi Meir's problem with just taking this verse at face value? Ulachein higia tzarich lomar mi beito. So this is shedding a teeny bit of light, but it isn't explaining it very fully, right? The Torah T'mimah at this point has it, but he's going to go on, and he says at least, and for this reason, he makes a note that one really needs to write mi beito and not leveito. Uvazeh yitba'er hetev, and through this one can now understand very well Dishnehem svirale, that both of them, that is, I imagine we're talking here about Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, they both hold the ein hachinami, okay, that in fact the masha amar hakatuv min umin hamikdash lo yetze, that in fact that when it says the scripture wrote that he should not depart from the sanctuary, Pirusho, in other words, he's saying that in fact it sounds at this point that both Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir hold she Pirusho mikdushato leitze, that both of them, that is Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir, hold that min hamikdash lo yetze means from his state of sanctity he should not depart. That neither of them actually hold that it means literally from the Beit HaMikdash itself. V'hainu, that is to say, sheyizaher milavo lidei tuma. So what in practical terms it means, he needs to be careful, very careful, not to wind up becoming defiled. V'rak Meir, Rabbi Meir Svilalei, and only Rabbi Meir holds the be'oseh heker, that when it comes, that in making a distinction, shuv lo, that he isn't going to, shuv lo chayshinan shiyitame. And so in other words, both of them hold that min hamikdash means his state of sanctity. But when it comes to making a distinction, Rabbi Meir holds that it's effective. Okay, V'rak Rabbi Meir svarle de be'oseh heker shuv lo chayshinan sheyitma, that only Rabbi Meir holds that if he makes some kind of distinction, we're not worried that he's going to be that he's going to become impure. V'Rabbi Yehuda sverla dilma agav merirutei lo yizaher. And Rabbi Yehuda holds that no, because he is in such a state of grief, he isn't going to be as meticulous and careful as he should be. Ulefize be'emet, and according to this explanation, be'emet isur echad hu, that both of them are understanding one prohibition, latzet achar hamet, that there is one prohibition to follow the procession. Bein im yatsa min hamikdash, whether or not he departs from the temple. Bein im yatsa mi beito, or whether he goes out from his house. Remember, that's the way the Bach read this, instead of leveito, from his house. In other words, if we understand this verse to mean he should not do anything to diminish his sanctity, it makes no difference whether we understand it to refer halachically to the temple itself or from his home. Either way, he isn't going to be, Rabbi Yehuda is going to hold that he isn't going to be able to follow the procession because he is so engulfed in grief, he's not going to be careful. And Rabbi Meir holds that, well, but no, if he makes some kind of distinction between himself and the procession, he is not going to wind up doing this. But al pize, okay, arvach lan ma'od. So he says, and if we understand this now, we've really drilled down, right? And according to this, we can now comfortably understand le'shev berchava divrei harambam. We can understand now even more something else, and that is to be able to explain well the words of Maimonides, Rambam, the Perek He in chapter 5, Halacha He, section 5, law, paragraph 5, Klei HaMikdash, I believe is what this is. In other words, we're talking now about the Mishneh Torah of Maimonides, and he has a section called, I believe, this is Klei HaMikdash, okay, the vessels of the temple, Shekatav V'Ze L'Shono, where the Rambam wrote, V'Ze L'Shono means, quote, this is what he says, Kohen Gadol Shemet Lomet, that if a Kohen Gadol has someone pass away, a close relative, loses a close relative, Eno Yotze Acharav, he doesn't follow the procession. And he goes on to say, Lo mi petach beito, neither from the entrance of his house, v'lo min hamikdash, nor from the temple. Whether he's in the temple itself or whether he's back home, he is not supposed to follow the procession. Ad kan l'shono, meaning end of quote. The Tameh HaKeshef Nishneh, and there's a commentary, a major commentary on the Rambam called Kesef Mishneh. And he says the Kesef Mishneh wondered greatly. He couldn't understand. Minayin lo, where did the Rambam get this? She'eno yotze gam mi petach beito. Where did the Rambam get this? It just says Mikdash, right? So why does it say? Why does the Rambam say from the entrance of his house? V'zeh de lo kaman, and this doesn't, it doesn't follow anything here. The Tarach Ma'od and the Kesef Mishneh worked very hard. He tried very hard, Le'ashev Hadvarim, to be able to explain the Rambam's words. Aval lefi ma shekatavnu, but if you look at what we just wrote, al pi hagahat habach, taking the note of the Bach into consideration. In other words, that we shouldn't say levetor, right, but rather mi betor, dvarav meirim me'od. The Rambam's words are very clear. We can understand very well what the Rambam wrote. Upaskako nachon kashemesh, and his psak din, his halacha that he wrote down, the Rambam, is as clear as sunshine, as clear as the sun. Yan ki be'emet, because indeed, in truth, halashon umin hamikdash lo yetze, that when the Torah says from the mikdash he should not go, lav dafka mi beit hamikdash, it doesn't really mean the temple itself. It doesn't literally mean the temple, ela mikdushato leyetze, but rather from his state of sanctity he should not go out. Aval be'emet gam mi beito asur, but in fact he cannot even leave his house, right? So now we know that, kemevuar, as we just explained, the dok hetev, and he says, QED, in flashing lights. And I'm going to stop right here with the share, and I'd love to see if you have any reactions at all to what we just did. All right, there we go. Yes.
I kind of missed how they changed le beito to mi beito.
Okay.
How did they change a mem and a lamed?
Okay. So well, of course, it's very easy to write a misprint, right? To have it down. Remember, a lot of this was oral at one point, but what the Bach so brilliantly says is, if we understand the Torah T'mimah, is that his sense is that it should not have been leveto. So the initial argument sounds like Rabbi Meir is saying you can't, if you're saying literally he can never leave the temple, and Judith, I suspect you know this already, right? Then Rabbi Meir is saying you can't take this literally because otherwise he never could go home, right? Leveto. But if you understand it as mi beito, from his home, then again, this is such an incredible piece of scholarship on the part of the Torah T'mimah, right? Then you can say that there is no distinction with a basic understanding of Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Meir. They both aren't taking the mikdash literally. They both understand mikdash, the Beit HaMikdash, or mikdushat, mikdash lo yetze, as meaning from his state of sanctity. All right.
That follows. I mean, I followed that one.
Right. So so the issue is, can he follow the funeral procession? And the Torah here is not saying simply that, well, he can't leave the sanctuary, he can't leave the temple. What it means is, since he cannot do anything to impugn his sanctity, whether he leaves his house or whether he leaves the temple, he is not allowed to follow the funeral procession.
But we have one rabbi saying, well, if he makes, a heker,
Correct.
he can. Right. And the other one saying, nah, he's going to be too overwhelmed with grief.
Correct.
Control. So he better just avoid the whole thing.
Right. But regardless, of course, it means he has to guard his sanctity.
Yeah.
Both of them.
Unless from yesterday, it's, there's a dead body lying around and no one to take care of it.
Yes,
then he is
that is correct. Correct. That is from a different verse, which throws an exception into this. Exactly. Very good. Yes.
Okay.
But I hope you enjoy this, because I think it is such a beautiful example of just how brilliant, right, the scholarship is of Baruch haLevi Epstein, the author of Torah T'mimah. The volume of it, the depth of it, it's amazing. I'm just amazed. He has to have this sort of encyclopedic knowledge of all these various sources, right? He's quoting the Bach, he's quoting Maimonides, he's quoting Kesef Mishnah. You've got that he studied all this stuff and retained it and has a sense of how to play the one, play against these things against each other to come up with this incredible commentary.
Yep. Thank you.
I
Any
don't
other-
understand,
Yes.
Rabbi.
Yes.
If he leaves the temple,
Yes.
he's got to change his clothes, right? He's got to take off his vestments.
That's
And
true.
then, okay, and then when he leaves the temple and he's still pure, but then if he touches something like a bug or something else, it becomes impure. Then he has to go and wash himself, wash the clothes, and at night he becomes pure again. Is that right?
No, it depends. Okay, you have the general concept going on, but there are different levels of impurity. And it's so interesting because there's another comment I came across which says he cannot make himself impure on account of a body. But on the other hand, if in fact, let's say someone else has a different kind, like for example, suppose his close relative is a leper, or suppose his close relative has another kind, like that flux we had talked about. Can he become impure for that? The answer is yes, that the Torah is specifying that specifically for a body, he cannot, for someone who's passed away, he cannot become impure. So yes, he could manifest impurity, for in these other kinds of ways that you mentioned. They don't all require the same level of process of cleansing, okay? But a lot of them do involve, a period of time of having to go to the mikveh. At the very least, he would have to go to the mikveh and possibly launder the clothes that he has. But but it's okay. I mean, it's great that you brought that up, because that clarifies something else now, that we're talking strictly about, following the funeral procession, coming in contact with a dead body. Okay. All right.
On that funeral procession, though, he has a right to perform the funeral procession for his mother and his father.
No, according to Rabbi Yehuda, he cannot do that. According to Rabbi Meir, he can, provided he creates some kind of, clear distinction as to prevent him from coming in contact with the body.
Wow, I can see that, but I can see his wife, who is from another people.
He can't do that.
He can't do that on his wife, but his mother and father, he can't.
Yes. Okay. So Harlan, I have to tell you, we're just about to read a verse which is going to tell us, the limitations on who he's allowed to marry as well. All right. But the general issue that you're bringing out now is that because of his relationship with God and his representing the entire Jewish people, he is the Jewish people, the entire nationhood. And I think we could possibly suggest that there's such a strong belief in life, in life beyond the physical life of this world, that it's all fine. That for that sake, his service to God precedes anything else.
Okay.
You're bringing out a very powerful issue in what we're dealing with. It's something we can talk about, because there are other disciplines which make him distinct from either his fellow priests who are not high priests, and certainly from us, from Israelites. But
so the other priest can't perform the funeral. I mean, who performs a funeral in the ancient days?
No. Okay, remember, no. Okay, performing a funeral can be done by a lay person. You don't need a priest to perform a funeral.
Okay.
This is talking about observing rites of mourning. That's what it's talking about. Not performing a funeral. Okay?
Yeah.
I'm going to stop the recording here and thank you. I hope you all found this interesting.